Hello, everyone. Welcome to Northwood University's Freedom Seminar. Today's presentation is from Jonathan Williams, who is an alum of our university and has gone on to very important roles as a leader in our political system. He is the chief economist and vice president for the Center for State Fiscal Reform at the American Legislative Exchange Council. He works with state policymakers, congressional leaders, and members of the private sector to develop fiscal policy solutions for the states. He's the author of Rich States, Poor States, along with Arthur Laffer. This is a book which every year ranks economic state competitiveness. And prior to joining ALEC, he was also the staff economist at the Tax Foundation, where he authored numerous tax policy studies. His work has appeared in many publications, including the Wall Street Journal, Forbes, and Investors Business Daily. He is a contributing columnist, tax analyst, the leading provider of tax news and analysis for the global community. He's written for the Ash Center for Democratic Governance and Innovation at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. And he was a contributing editor and author of In Defense of Capitalism, published by our own Northwood University Press. So today, he's going to talk to us about a free market approach to reviving the economy amid COVID-19 distress. Thank you, Jonathan Williams, for joining us here today. I appreciate that.
Well, thank you, Dr. Matchek, and good afternoon, everyone. I hope you all are staying healthy and safe in these very strange times in which we live. To spend some time with you today and be back with the Freedom Seminar. Only wish I could be with you in person, but this will have to do for now. And I wanted to give you some overview of some of our thoughts from a public policy perspective at free market approaches for how policymakers in Washington, D.C., as well as in state capitals across our 50 states, can really work to make things more advantageous for individuals and businesses going forward. As we turn the corner, let's all hope and pray on this horrible health aspect, and now be able to focus on rebooting our economy, rebooting our communities, and rebooting really our livelihood as a nation. And so I'm going to share with you some overview both on federal and state levels of policymaking. And then towards the end, before we go to questions, because I want to save plenty of time to hear your comments and questions as well, I wanted to give you a brief update on some of the moving pieces in Washington, D.C. that you may see in the news as we go throughout today and the weekend, of things that we've watched closely and been involved with from an educational basis here in Washington. But a little of the preface that Dr. Matchek gave is it wasn't all that many years ago. I was sitting in your shoes or in your seats at the Freedom Seminar at Northwood University in the economics and finance program where I graduated in 2005. And as many of you, I'm sure, Michigan native myself from the Tri-City area. And so it's always great to come back home. And what I get to do, as I like to say, on a daily basis, is I get to work on really the Northwood idea in practice as we work with policymakers at all levels of government. And what my organization does, the American Legislative Exchange Council, is we are a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization dedicated to education and best practices in economic policymaking. And as you can see on the slide there, we're devoted to three core principles: limited government, free markets, and federalism. And everything in which we discuss today as it relates to public policy making and best practices, I think it's really important to point back to the first principles of why under our system of constitutional government in the United States, how these approaches to a response to a pandemic in this case, or any kind of economic crisis, I think must be rooted in good public policy and good principles. And when we started this discussion internally at the front end of the pandemic back in March, really, when it hit the United States in a way that was starting to shut down businesses and shut down individuals, and we saw the stay-at-home orders issued by governors, not only in Michigan, of course, with Governor Whitmer, but governors across the United States. we saw a very wide range in what public policymakers were proposing in terms of both a health shutdown order perspective as well as economic restrictions or new economic laws, or even in a better case, a repeal and a revisiting of economic restrictions and burdensome laws. And it reminded me recently a story that my co-author of Rich States, Poor States, as Dr. Matchek pointed out, the famous economist, Dr. Arthur Laffer, President Reagan's economic advisor in the 1970s as governor of California, and then 1980s, of course, as president of the United States. He retold a story from the 1980s in the White House, where, as at least the story goes, President Reagan, I think dealing with the savings and loan crisis of the late 1980s, looked to one of his economic staffers and said, "Don't just stand there, go undo something." And instead of kind of the natural reaction, I think, of government is to grow in times of crisis and to move to more government intervention in the economy, more central planning, unfortunately, in many cases. You always have heard the line that I think originated with perhaps the philosopher of the left, Saul Alinsky, but then was repeated in recent years by Rahm Emanuel, former chief of staff to President Obama and member of Congress and then mayor of Chicago. Never let a good crisis go to waste, unfortunately, is the mantra from some of those that would like to grow government. We've taken the opposite approach. We've wanted to follow a free market approach to economic recovery and thinking about ways that government can reduce the burden on businesses and individuals and reduce burdensome laws and regulations that would free the economy and get people back to their livelihood. And so that's been our kind of starting point, is looking at ways that instead of always passing something new, and let me be clear in that sometimes that is necessary, is obviously pass new laws and regulations to deal with critical health issues, critical economic issues. But more often than not, it's more beneficial to revisit those laws on the books, revisit regulations, and see what actually makes sense as our economy now transitions into this new normal or a very uncertain period. Some of you may have seen the news just today where Michigan is now expecting a budget shortfall in the range of nearly $3 trillion, or I'm thinking in federal numbers, sorry, $3 billion when it comes to the Michigan revenue downturn and the Michigan budget. But that discussion is playing out all over America and states. And then certainly as we looked at the federal level, that is where the dollars are in the trillions. And even today, I believe there will be consideration of a proposal in the United States House to spend trillions more in federal spending on aid to the states. And we'll talk about that and why that's a bit of a counterintuitive proposal that we would have a problem with as a state organization on a principle basis. And so we've been educating on that issue when it comes to a bailout of the state and local units of government, for instance. And then we also are watching as states come back into session. I know in Lansing this week, I was talking to a group of Michigan legislators this morning. They spent time in Lansing, and they're looking at ways to obviously both address very acute budget shortfalls at state and local unit of government, as well as open up the economy and get people back to their livelihoods. Now, I think it's awfully important to kind of start with the basics when it comes to how budgets at the government level will respond to this kind of pandemic, and that is at the federal level, of course, they do not have a balanced budget requirement. They do obviously have a lot of other ways as well to influence the economy through Federal Reserve and U.S. Treasury action that we've seen through municipal liquidity approach that they've put forward in recent weeks. They have the ability to use quantitative easing and otherwise what we used to know as running the printing presses in Washington to make more resources. Obviously, that has a longer-term consequence on potential value of the dollar, inflation, many other kind of macroeconomic and monetary policy concerns. At the state and local level, it's much different. And that, as an organization at ALEC, we primarily work with state level officials to represent your communities, both at the state capital level and the local level. And at the state and local level, it's a much different discussion. As I was talking with Michigan legislators today, they're looking at ways to how do you honor Michigan's balanced budget requirement? And 49 out of the 50 states actually have balanced budget requirements versus Washington, who does not here in D.C. And that's a much different discussion. And policymakers in Lansing are looking to try to solve this nearly $3 billion budget shortfall based on recent projections without needing to go back and raise taxes, because I think it's awfully important at this time to not hit individuals or businesses when they're really down or having to be shuttered in place or having their livelihoods and businesses shut down for an extended period of time. Obviously, the last thing that they need is having some new tax burden put on them. So I think representatives in Lansing are thinking exactly the right way of how to balance the budget without raising taxes. So as you go to the next slide, Dr. Matchek, we've outlined across different areas at the federal level that we've been working on in terms of different ways that perhaps President Trump, and we may have many people here who like President Trump on the call today and the webinar, and we may have lots of people who do not like President Trump today. But I think that one thing that hopefully everyone can agree on is he has done, I think, a phenomenal job in the aspect of allowing state and local units of government to actually govern and take the lead during this approach. Instead of federalizing, having a one-size-fits-all solution coming from a central government in Washington, D.C., let's say dictating a nationwide shutdown or a nationwide policy that's one-size-fits-all, would have been very damaging, I think, during this crisis moment. And I think the president deserves a whole lot of credit for respecting the principle of federalism. And oftentimes when people hear the word federalism, it's a little bit counterintuitive what it means. Some people think that that means federalism means federal government taking more control, when it's actually the opposite. Our founders, I think, were very wise when they put together our republic and our constitutional system, that they wanted a balance of power between the federal government and the states and local units of government and then individuals and communities. And they wanted the states to be first and foremost, because it was the states that created the federal government, not the other way around, when you look at the history of the United States. And so they wanted states to be the focus of many of the important decisions, and communities to be that focus where those debates happen, because those debates then happen closer to individuals that have the ability to be involved with the process and to actually talk with local officials and state officials, versus having a far-off government in Washington, D.C. have a one-size-fits-all approach, because they were only dealing with the 13 colonies at the time, but obviously we have 50 states now, 50 laboratories of democracy, as Justice Brandeis would say, and they have very different ways of governing. And I think that's an important attribute to our system of government in the United States, where governing in Arizona looks much different than governing in New York, and the needs of Florida are much different than the needs of Alaska. And so I think that the idea of federalism is devolving the very important decisions many times, and the vast majority of decisions, away from a one-size-fits-all federal government to the states and people of the states. And that's, of course, in our Bill of Rights. If you remember, the 10th Amendment to the Bill of Rights is those powers not directly given to the federal government should be reserved for the states and the people of the states. That's something that I think people of both parties in previous years have forgotten. We've seen a massive growth in the federal government. We've seen now a national debt, where I encourage you all to frequently check the national debt clock. It's a great resource to see exactly how indebted our country is. We have now hit the mark of $25 trillion in national debt. That's a scary total, and it's up tremendously from even 10 years ago. The last time we went through a financial crisis, 2008, 2009, we were looking at a national debt in the vicinity of only $10 trillion, and I put quotation marks around only $10 trillion. It was still obviously a very high number, far too high even then, but to go from 10 trillion to 25 trillion in national debt in a matter of about a decade or one business cycle is tremendously problematic when it comes to where we're headed, our trajectory, and what that debt burden means on future generations, and the ability of us to be able to thrive and prosper as a nation, as an economy. And individual taxpayers and business taxpayers are going to certainly be called upon, if spending habits don't change very quickly, being called upon for increased taxes, increased contributions to pay down the debt. So a few of the solutions that we've at least outlined as possible things to consider based on good free market principles that we outlined here in this op-ed that I had in the Hill newspaper, Free Market Approach to Reviving the Economy Amid COVID-19 Distress. One of them is looking at federal spending, looking at whether it's a balanced budget amendment, but I tend to think it needs to be a little stronger than that, because 49 out of the 50 states have a balanced budget amendment, as I mentioned, but you still have the cases of Illinois and California in states that, even with a balanced budget amendment, there's so many holes in there, and ability for, unfortunately, policymakers to avoid real controls on debt and spending, that it makes a bit of a mockery of the process. And so either it needs to be strongly written, such as states like Indiana or others that have it very strictly written to avoid games being played around the balanced budget requirement, or probably even better is, as we outline in the piece, having some sort of a constitutional protection against overspending. And that's something like Colorado has done effectively through, they call a Taxpayers' Bill of Rights, which allows state and local government to grow, but not faster than the private sector and not faster than the economy grows. So kind of a common sense solution, perhaps, to stopping the growth of the accumulation of national debt and spending. And it's one of these things, I know Dr. Matchek and I have talked about this ad nauseum over the years, and we both are on the same page, I think, here, is that what we need is strong economic growth. We need to have consistent GDP growth to help us grow our way out of the problem, but we also need some spending discipline and something like what works at the state level with Colorado's Taxpayer Bill of Rights. That's one of the ideas we talked about. Another is the idea of free trade. And obviously that has been in the news a whole lot in recent years. And there certainly have been some bad actors around the world that have tried to manipulate trade and have not done the right things for protecting private property rights and other aspects of it. So it's a big, complicated topic, obviously. But obviously, if we move towards more of a free trade scenario with at least allies and double down on free trade commitments, let's say in the Wall Street Journal, that hopefully all of you are reading on a very regular basis. I remember fondly my time at Northwood, having the hard copies provided there in Jordan and picking up a copy every morning. And the secret of reading the Wall Street Journal, as I've come to understand, is reading the opinion page first and then getting to the news section, because the opinion page, I think, is best, bar none, in the United States, run by Paul Jagot and so many great free market voices there in the Wall Street Journal. But as they've detailed on those pages in recent days, there's real opportunities for the United States to expand free trade with allies such as the United Kingdom, who have been a bit ostracized from the Brexit exercise there with the EU, that they need additional trading partners to give them confidence for their economic growth and recovery. But, you look across the board, when you look at some of the issues that we had or potentially still have as it relates to dealing with the pandemic and supply chain concerns and getting products and safety products and protective gear in the United States, the last thing we need to be doing is putting up restrictive trade barriers that will keep needed goods and services out of the United States during such a crisis moment, and to disrupt supply chains, which are obviously very complicated to get needed products in the United States. So that's another area we talk about. And then a couple of more, narrower ideas outside of those broad areas that we just talked about were ways that the federal government in past crises under both Republican and Democrat administrations have waived certain requirements and regulations that keep costs on the economy that otherwise could be removed if there would be some sort of a waiver. So a couple of examples of this, and some of you may be familiar after reading at public policy discussions at various organizations in Washington or following the news, but one is the Jones Act that has been on the books for nearly 100 years that requires all basically merchant marine vessels to be U.S. owned, U.S. crewed, U.S. flagged, and have a lot of protections there. And maybe, during the initial debate over when that was enacted, some of those protections would have been valuable from a national security perspective. There's been studies done by the Cato Institute, among others here in Washington, showing that it adds tremendously the cost of goods shipped into the United States. So every consumer in the United States pays extra basically on imported goods because of this regulation on shipping. And then you add that and it exacerbates the problem for areas such as Puerto Rico, areas such as Hawaii and Alaska that rely so heavily on things being shipped that they're not producing, let's say, on the islands or on in a place like Alaska. Just one example of a regulation that could be waived that could save U.S. consumers significant money, as well as very acutely save states like Alaska and Hawaii. And then you look at something like the Davis-Bacon Act, and some of you may have read about that in public policy class as well. That's nearly 100 years old. It's a federal law that requires prevailing wage laws that are very imprecise to be applied to any state or local project that takes, I think it's more than $2,000 in federal aid for that project. So on an issue like highways or infrastructure in Michigan, or school construction, let's say, in Michigan, unfortunately, regulations such as Davis-Bacon add between maybe 15, 20, 25% to the cost of repairing or constructing new roads and bridges, or even schools, public schools across the state of Michigan. And so that's something that presidents of both parties have waived in past crises, and it's something that I think is being discussed in Washington as a way to help the states help enhance infrastructure and school construction, doing it in a more efficient way that doesn't require a dollar of federal support, but actually frees the economy in states like Michigan that have moved towards having repealing things like prevailing wage laws at the state level, freeing them from that extra federal cost that's being put needlessly on a state like Michigan. So those are a few things that we're talking about in Washington when it comes to regulatory approaches that can be used to help states, but more importantly, help individuals and businesses weather this storm that will hopefully be a short-term moment in time. But Professor Matchak, you can go to the next slide. And that just details a little bit more what I was talking about there. One of the other aspects that I should mention that all of you may have already taken advantage of or are in the process of taking advantage of is generally we don't associate the words IRS, Internal Revenue Service, with generosity. This year was a little bit of an anomaly in that thankfully for the U.S. Treasury and the IRS, they announced that tax day would not be April 15th, but would be July 15th this year to help people have more time to get their paperwork together to file their taxes, or perhaps even more importantly is if they owed taxes, they would be able to pay them by July 15th instead of April 15th at the federal level. And I think that will be a massive help in some cases to businesses that need to devote time to trying to keep their businesses afloat and try to keep their doors open right now during what is one of the most challenging environments in recent memory, especially for small businesses. And so I was very happy to see that approach at the federal level. And then as we've talked about this, and states have followed the lead when it comes to that federal change in tax filing and payment deadlines, nearly every single state with an income tax, like Michigan, has also moved their state level tax deadlines for filing and payment back to July or later, which is great in that it frees those businesses and individuals in the states affected that have moved their deadlines, which I think it's something like 38 out of the 41 states with personal income taxes on wage income have moved their tax filing and payment deadlines to July or later this year, giving people much needed relief from the tax man and from having to worry about tax filings and compliance and perhaps having a problem trying to meet with their tax preparer in person, given the restrictions on travel and restrictions on business openings. It's just a much needed regulatory relief that doesn't really cost the federal government a thing other than timing of payments to some degree, but it could be a huge help for businesses and individuals going forward. So those are a few at the federal level. And the next slide details some of the things that we've put together at the state and local level. So if you go to the ALEC website, alec.org, that slide you can look at the policy prescriptions document that we've come up with 30 different policy ideas for free market reforms at state and local units of government that can be adopted, that many states have already begun taking up as they come back into session. And they're based on ALEC model policy that is on the books, that has been vetted in many cases, already passed in other states. And you look at things such as budgets, for instance, as I talked a little bit about. States are going to see, I think, some pretty massive budget shortfalls in the weeks and months ahead. Michigan's, as was mentioned, was announced this morning. We are seeing across the country estimates of state budget shortfalls for the coming year range between $200 and $250 billion based on estimates that I've seen. And the average state may be down on their revenue from projections between 10 and 15%, with some states being way above that. If you're a top oil and gas producing state, I don't know how many of you follow the oil markets, but it's been a very volatile ride the last couple of months, since March at least, and oil states have been way down with the price of oil, and that's going to have a more acute effect in those states than, let's say, the average state during the pandemic and the revenue downturn. And so one of the things that we've been focusing on is how do states responsibly balance their budgets without raising taxes. And one of the resources we have available is, we call it the State Budget Reform Toolkit, and it's on the ALEC website. If you Google State Budget Reform Toolkit, it will be the first thing that you see. And those are the ideas that we've come up with, some free market ways to, let's say, look for efficiencies. What are businesses and families doing right now on a weekly or a monthly basis? They're deciding between needs and wants. They're deciding what's the incoming revenue that we have, or incoming income that we have in our individual situations, and what is it that we can afford to spend on, and looking at what are the most core things that we need to spend our money on. And many times, unfortunately, when times are good, state and local and federal government doesn't necessarily always think that way. When times are good and revenues are coming in very quickly, it's always kind of a race to see who can spend that money first in many cases. And so now it's giving governments the opportunity to right-size their budgets, to prioritize their budgets. And there's lots of ways that this has worked in other states in the past. This idea of prioritizing budgets just like families and individuals and businesses do. A couple of the other things that we've thought about at the state level, which I just was interviewed for a piece in Governing Magazine, and the author of the piece asked me from a kind of a futurist perspective, what are the things that we think, based on the changes to the economy and the changes to the world really in the era of the COVID pandemic, what are things that's going to change permanently perhaps about public policy making, or about how government provides services to its taxpayers? And in a couple of those areas, I think looking at virtual education, right, that what's going on right now as we have the Freedom Seminar virtually versus in person. Obviously, there's been regulations that were in place at the federal level that Secretary Betsy DeVos, a Michigan native, has waived. There's also been many restrictions that state and local units of government had placed on, mostly state, on education and virtual learning that are now being revisited or repealed, at least in the temporary period. But I think it does sort of beg the question that if these regulations didn't make sense against virtual learning in normal times, or in this position, why would it be any different in normal times when we get back to a post-COVID environment? Another area that hopefully none of you have had to use, but it's a great option for those that need it, is telehealth, and being able to use app-based ways to connect with health providers that are fully licensed, obviously, that are fully functional health providers that may even have physical locations, but are able to provide consultations via a conversation like we're having right now, pulling up your iPhone and having a conversation on a video chat with the health provider. being able to prescribe prescriptions for various conditions that way, or renew prescriptions that way without going in and needing to see a provider. Because whether it's safe or you're hopefully not a compromised, the high-risk individual, but even if you're not, you may not feel comfortable in going out to a doctor's office right now where you may be exposed to COVID or other things. And so having this option and waiving government regulations that in many cases had really inhibited telehealth providers from operating in a free marketplace pre-COVID, I think there's going to be a real rethinking of some of those burdensome regulations now that they've been proven to be, I think, obsolete or burdensome on both the business side and individuals trying to get quality health care. And then another thing that's made the kind of top tier of national news in the last couple of weeks I wanted to touch on, because I hear it from so many different businesses, mostly small businesses that I've talked to, and many of the state legislators that we work with are also business owners. And Michigan is a little bit unique in that it has a full-time legislature, we consider it in Michigan, and so many times that takes up 110% of the time of those individuals that are serving in Lansing. But in many other states, it's a much different approach in that their state legislators, while they may put in unlimited hours in serving their constituents, are only in session for a small part of the year. So I'm thinking of Indiana. I just had a conversation there with one of the state senators from northern Indiana along the Michigan border who owns a golf course. And they're done with their session as of March, and then they go back into private life and try to go back to their livelihoods. And she owns a golf course, and she was talking about one of the issues that is a real big one for a lot of small business owners across states, and that is liability issues. Even if health restrictions are waived in as health outcomes improve and as we find that it's safe to go out and actually open parts of our economy, as states are already doing today, what about the issue of small businesses that don't have the confidence to reopen because they're afraid that if they reopen their doors and somebody then claims that they perhaps caught some sort of an illness, hopefully not anything serious, but it may be something like COVID, when they were in their facility shopping or in their restaurant dining and having a dinner out with their family, that somehow there would be some sort of legal liability against the business. And I think it's really important as we talk about this, President Trump's talked about it from the federal level, and governors and state lawmakers are talking about it at the state level, that would differentiate between this is not protecting bad actors that are businesses that are not taking the right precautions. There's obviously still standards for gross negligence of people that have not taken the precautions to protect both customers and employees. That's separate from this conversation. I think what most of the states and the federal government is looking at is how do we have some sort of a limited liability shield to protect both customers and employees when businesses are following all CDC guidelines for best practices to protect people. And then it really becomes incumbent on the private sector to lead, because when we have real confidence on a small business side, let's say, of being able to reopen your doors and not being afraid to be litigated out of business, or at least fighting frivolous lawsuits because trial lawyers would like to come in and have a massive payday, and then you'd be taken away from your livelihood just to fight the lawsuit, even if you think you're going to win the lawsuit. What about a scenario then that the private sector could lead? And I think that's what it's going to take. Is many businesses are already taking the lead. In Washington D.C. here, I read the Washington Post, and many of you are familiar with this chain that I think is pretty active in Michigan and has lots of locations. Aldi, the German supermarket chain, just breaking into Washington D.C. market. They've been running full-page ads in the Washington Post talking about all the precautions that they, as a private business, are taking. Not because some government regulator told them they needed to take the precautions necessarily, but because they wanted to instill customer confidence as well as employee confidence that people could come and operate in a free marketplace and have that goods and services available to them and have their livelihood and their paycheck back. But it's not going to be a bureaucrat sitting at the Department of Health and Human Services that hits some magical light switch to say it's safe to come back and operate in the economy again. it's going to need to be a concerted effort led by, I think, private sector employers to make sure that their employees know that they'll be protected, and as well as their customers will be protected to come back, and then have individuals be able to take on risk to some degree to say, I realize that anything you do in life is going to entail some level of risk. By me getting in the car and going into the office or going to the supermarket, I entail some sort of a risk that I may be involved in an accident on the way there. But you realize that you need to operate, given that level of risk, that things that are going to be valuable for you long term. So I think it's going to require a real commitment from the private sector to lead and to be able to show confidence both to employees and to customers to kind of reopen and allow the marketplace to get back to something closer to normal. I don't think it's going to take a big government approach. It's going to take private sector innovators to really be the lead on this. You can go to the next slide there, Professor Matchek. And I guess that is the end of the formal presentation, but I wanted to leave my contact information here for all of you, and I'll go into that in just a moment. But one of the other things that I really wanted to discuss, because it's been at the top of the news in recent days and recent weeks, is the idea of what's next at the federal level. What do we expect in terms of the package that I believe policymakers in the House maybe already have voted on? If not, they will be voting on today, a new spending package that would add, I think, something like $3 trillion of spending in addition to what's already been spent as part of the COVID response. And obviously we can get into questions of what's there and anything that you all would like to know what's moving at the federal level. But one of the things I think is really essential as part of the debate that's been happening, not specifically to this piece of legislation necessarily, but overall over the last couple of months, and that is the idea that the federal government could or should bail out the states and send billions, hundreds of billions, if not more than $1 trillion in some estimates, to state and local units of government. And I think that's very dangerous for a couple of principled reasons, a couple of economic reasons, and I want to talk a little bit about that. In addition to that, in some of the headlines, you've probably seen a discussion around the idea of state bankruptcy. And I think Senator Mitch McConnell of Kentucky, the Senate Majority Leader, brought that up as maybe an alternative to a bailout of states. And so I wanted to talk through a few of the public policy considerations as it relates to that. You've all probably been familiar, being Michigan folks, I would assume the majority of our attendees today, with the Detroit bankruptcy that happened back a number of years ago that was overseen by Judge Stephen Rhodes. And it's obviously lots of causes for that. That's a conversation for a whole nother day. I've gone into that in detail in previous Freedom Seminar discussions. And when I get asked about this, as I travel to 50 states and work with state policymakers, I've been asked about it hundreds of times over the years in my 15 years or so of working on public policy issues after graduating from Northwood in 2005. And people ask, what is the idea? Is there an idea for a state bankruptcy proceeding? Is that available as an option? And then also the follow-up to that, is it a good option for public policy making? And first of all, there is no provision in the U.S. Constitution as originally intended, or there's no provision in U.S. bankruptcy law dealing with state bankruptcies. It's just an area that was silent. Perhaps that I think to some degree the founders saw the states and they intended our system of federalism to be set up as the states were the sovereign units of government. And the states came together and created the federal government. It wasn't the other way around. As we talked about earlier, in the 10th Amendment to the Bill of Rights, those things not directly given to the federal government were supposed to be reserved for the states and the people of the states. And so I think probably the founders would have looked back and said, why is it that we need any kind of federal overseen bankruptcy protection for the states? The states can govern themselves. They have taxing authority. They have, in some cases, the ability to carry debt apart from a balanced budget requirement. But they have the ability to levy taxes directly on their citizens with income and property and sales taxes and other ways that they raise revenue. Why would they reach out and really, in a way, ask for the federal government to come in and socialize their costs to taxpayers in other states, perhaps? whether that's through a bailout or through some sort of bankruptcy proceeding. Now, you do run into some situations where states like Illinois, and I don't know, you may have some people today that are from Illinois watching, being part of Freedom Seminar here. That's been a state that's struggled mightily in recent years. That's been a state that's lost hundreds of thousands of its residents to other states because they were looking for more economic opportunity and couldn't find a job in Illinois, let's say, or the taxes were too high in Illinois and that they've driven out many businesses and individuals to other states. And Illinois is a state that has continued spending, has racked up billions in unfunded pension liabilities for state and local government workers, has not put away the required payments to actually pay for those promises to state and local government pensions and health care benefits. And then just recently, Illinois policymakers reached out, at least some policymakers from Illinois did, and asked for more than $40 billion from the federal government to come in and bail out a state like Illinois. So a state like Illinois, or maybe Connecticut, or some of the others that have some very, very severe pension liabilities and budget problems, may get to a spot, if there's no course correction taken, where they could potentially default on state debt and just stop paying creditors, something similar to what we've seen in countries around the world. We saw it, of course, with Puerto Rico as more of a U.S. territory, but we've seen it with Greece, recently with Lebanon, announced that they would stop making payments on groups that held debt, let's say. So you may get into a scenario where eventually states deteriorate their situation to a degree where they would just stop making payments. Then there would be litigation, but that would be somewhat separate from a holistic approach to a bankruptcy, such as we saw in Detroit, such as we see in municipalities or with corporate entities across the United States. And there may be some attributes of having more of a structured process around bankruptcy, but I think what's key is whether it's a bailout we're talking about of states or whether it's a bankruptcy proceeding, is the moral hazard question, as we would say in economics, is that what are the incentives that the federal government, or in this case Americans, would be giving to state and local policymakers and officials if they think that every time that there's some sort of a hardship that they're going to get bailed out by taxpayers in the other 49 states. It would be socializing their costs out on the entire United States, which may be, in the short term, might seem very lucrative to a state like Illinois or Connecticut or others that are very acutely in debt. However, if that incentive is wrong, when you make an incentive wrong in this case, we're going to get a whole lot more of that behavior in the future. And that's really what's disturbing about the discussion of a bailout of states and potentially bankruptcy, is if it was going to be a get out of jail free card, so to speak, for state and local governments to overspend, and then have some sort of a event happen at the federal level, whether it's a financial crisis or any kind of emergency, where then the federal government come in and not just make states whole from COVID-related expenses, because that's already happened to a lot of degree. What's already been appropriated in Washington, with $225 billion already going to the states to deal directly with COVID-related expenses. This is actually the next round, potentially of nearly $1 trillion going to state and local governments, would be to backfill many of the problems that have been in place for many, many months, if not many years, or even in some cases decades prior to the pandemic, into the current economic crisis that we find ourselves in. And then, in addition, regardless if the state would be a quote-unquote winner or a loser from the scenario of a bailout of the most indebted states, I think regardless of that, you have the idea that why is it helpful for the long term? In fact, I'll phrase it a different way, is it would be absolutely harmful for the long term for state and local units of government to become overly dependent on federal support. And that is because every dollar that goes from Washington, D.C. to the states, there's no such thing as a free lunch, as Milton Friedman would say. They come with many costly regulations and rules and strings, as we say. One of them is the maintenance of effort requirements, that people who want to do the right thing and budget responsibly at the state level are therefore then prohibited from doing so by taking federal funds and agreeing to the maintenance of effort requirements and many other strings that come with the federal funds that really tie the hands of responsible policymakers at the state and local level. it's gotten to such a degree, even before this current discussion around the bailout of states or some sort of a bankruptcy idea, that some states that are more free market in nature, and I'm thinking of Utah and Idaho, actually states #1 and #2 in our annual ranking of the states for economic competitiveness in rich states, poor states that Dr. Matchek just told you about in my introduction. Those are states that have put together plans to actually analyze federal funds as they come into their state and to look at the rules and regulations that surround those funds to say, maybe it's the case that we say no thank you to federal government support. As counterintuitive as that may seem, those legislators and business leaders in the states that have come together with this idea called Financial Ready Utah and Financial Ready Idaho have said sometimes the dollars actually cause more problems and cause more costs to accrue at the state and local levels of government than the short-term government funds. And so that's been an interesting discussion as we travel to 50 states and work with state policymakers as this whole approach and this whole idea of federalism is really crystallized, I think, in people's minds as it relates to this current discussion in Washington, D.C. So with that, let me just say, you've got my contact information there on the final slide, and it's something I always say during my Freedom Seminar talks, and I've, I think, done this now for, gosh, nearly 15 years straight, and I really appreciate the opportunity to speak to some great students there at my alma mater and to always reconnect with Dr. Matchek, one of my favorite economics professors. And my contact is there for one simple reason, and that is if you ever need assistance in Washington, D.C., if you'd like to be involved in the public policy space for career-wise, for internships, or just curious as to what a free market think tank does and the resources that we have that could potentially help change the business environments in Michigan or wherever you're from as you go back into the private sector as you graduate, count on me as a resource. My phone number is there, my email's there. Follow me on social media if you're interested in this kind of public policy free market discussion. Always want to be there for you as a fellow Northwood grad and really encourage you to stay involved regardless of your outlook on the economy, regardless of your political background. Just stay involved because America needs more people that have a business background engaged in government decisions, engaged in this really important and essential public policy work that we're all engaged in right now, because I really think that when it comes to the future of America, we've got some big challenges ahead. First and foremost is this health pandemic and the challenge related there. But secondly, we have a whole lot of work to do to get our economy rebooted and to tackle what is potentially an existential threat to our nation going forward, and that is the national debt and the unfunded liabilities that we carry. So we need all of you involved, and I really appreciate the opportunity and your attention today.
Thank you, Jonathan. Gave us a lot of information there, and there are quite a few questions already for us. I want to invite the participants to go to the tab on the right of your screen under the Q&A. Don't put your questions in the chat. Put them in that Q&A icon there, and hopefully we'll have time to get to them. So, I have a question here from Logan. He says, it seems that state governments and in some cases the federal government are deciding the level of risk that small businesses can take to serve their customers. Isn't there a case to be made that businesses all must assume risk and that they should have some say in assuming risks that are related to COVID?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. It's one that policymakers at the state level have been grappling with now for weeks. And there's been actually a pretty big battle, as you've seen, not only in Michigan, but in many states, of perhaps different philosophies on that question between the executive branch and the legislative branch of government. And then in Michigan right now, it's going to probably take the judicial branch of government to resolve the differences in opinion on that question and many other questions as it relates to federal funding and what the states can do with the money and what the priorities of the governors versus the legislative branch would be on the federal support going into state governments right now that's already been appropriated. And then some of these questions around business openings and the reopening of the economy and reopening of communities. I know Senate Majority Leader Mike Shirkey in Michigan, who's a business owner who's been very, I think, open-minded about lots of free market things, and I think he's a great free market guy. It started kind of his own task force among the Michigan State Senate members. I think one of them from mid-Michigan, Ken Horn, from Representative Saga, sat on that commission to come up with ways to help bring guidelines that would safely reopen businesses, and not to obviously force business to reopen, but allow them to, as you say in the question, to be able to see if that's best for that business and if they want to assume that risk, and if they can instill confidence from their employees and from their customers to come back and participate in a free marketplace. It would at least give them the freedom to do so. I think, personally at least, there was probably, and I'm not speaking in a specific case here, but in some cases across the country, there was a bit of an error where I think, unfortunately, there was a paradigm of essential versus non-essential that was often classified as parts of this debate that I think was happening to small business owners, and you talk to people across the nation, and that instead of doing a binary essential versus non-essential, which obviously at the very best case of that makes people feel horrible if you fall into a non-essential category. I really don't, there's such a thing as a non-essential individual or a non-essential business, right? I mean, that's all very subjective in the eyes of some sort of government planner that I think is fraught with lots of problems. But I think the smarter approach would have been to say not non-essential versus essential, but high risk and low risk, and a kind of a spectrum of what are the infection potentials depending on your type of business, the interaction that you normally have with individuals, how many people would normally be exposed, and what kind of precautions that you would take, let's say, on a free market to instill confidence in your customers and also in your employees that they can operate and calculate risks and operate in a free marketplace. So that's kind of my initial thoughts on that. And I really do think many states made a big mistake early on in this process to classify it in a binary essential versus non-essential, when there's much, much smarter ways to go about looking at what is actually a high risk action versus a lower risk action.
Okay. So we have another question from Bob here who asks, what role does the federal government have in protecting our economy from sliding into another great recession or even a Great Depression?
Well, it's one question that is obviously first and foremost with the president, his economic team, Larry Kudlow, the members of Congress. The Federal Reserve has taken pretty unprecedented action as well in terms of inserting liquidity into the marketplace to ensure that businesses had a lending window to go towards to get funds in case there was any kind of lockup in terms of lending from institutional banks and others. And also, I think it's important to note that the Federal Reserve has now given the opportunity for large municipalities and states to access a credit window as well. So they've done some pretty unprecedented things from the Federal Reserve position on monetary policy, and that's probably a whole discussion for another day on if that's a overly aggressive or if that's an appropriate action. Then there's, of course, the fiscal policy side, and that is still being decided as we speak here today as to what the next round is going to look like in Washington. And obviously you have to balance short-term needs with long-term costs in many cases, and that's difficult for elected officials to do sometimes. And this isn't a partisan slam in any sense. Both parties have been guilty, I think, in the past, it's safe to say, at racking up the national debt and overspending. But elected officials, many times, are governed by their own incentives, different than economic incentives, in that they have the incentive to A, get reelected, and B, do things that will help them in the short term during their reelection period in many cases, to make it look like they're doing something. And many times they're doing important things, and that's always, I'm not discounting the idea that you need to do something at times during the crisis. However, what they're not judged on many times is the long-term debt and liabilities that they're racking up in the years, or in some cases decades, after the actions are taken. And in many cases, unfortunately, the political economy of this, so to speak, is the idea then that those elected officials know that the costs of their actions won't come due until they're far out of office, and their successors have to deal with those issues. And so I think there's a bit of an incentive problem many times to overreact to crises, and that's why at the start of this discussion, I think we've taken a bit of a different approach to say sometimes it's not going to be new government spending that's going to solve the issue and the many real economic challenges that are at hand right now. Sometimes it's simply removing burdensome regulations and rules and repealing laws that allow individuals and businesses to flourish in a free market society. And things like waiving Davis-Bacon that could save millions of dollars across states for new construction without a bailout of the states needed are exactly the kind of thing that I think policymakers are thinking of that doesn't always require a new government appropriation. But there is a role in the federal government, obviously, in a situation like this. I'm not saying that it's only state and local units of government. There is a role, and obviously the CDC has an important role in putting down guidelines and making sure that we know the best practices, and states and governors are really taking a lead on implementing those. And you can agree or disagree, let's say, with individual governors' actions. Some have been very passive, some have been very aggressive in implementing regulations, but the federal government does have a role as well. I just think that oftentimes it does overplay its hand and probably gets us into a lot of problems with longer term debt than what would be needed. Because when you analyze something that's in, let's say, Speaker Pelosi's package in this new round of funding requests, I'm told by Congressman Jim Banks, a good friend of mine from Indiana that I mentioned earlier, he said that the summary of this bill alone is 90 pages long. And so we're talking about massive new federal legislation that includes spending across lots of different areas, much of which is not related to COVID, much of which is just policy changes that are going to be made as part of this package. So the federal government does have a role. I would like to see it obviously as limited as possible and to allow federalism to work and allow state and local units to really take the lead in this time, though.
So, Jonathan, I want to follow up on this question a little bit. You mentioned your good friend, the congressman, and so you have developed a knowledge of politicians that most of us don't have, and their motives. And I notice you talk about the incentives that politicians face, but it seems to me like a lot of that responsibility falls back on us, the voter, right? Because after all, it's we who reward or punish politicians for their policies. So now let's shift the focus. I guess, first of all, I want you to address the motives of politicians. Is it too cynical for us to think that, they're in it to win elections and whatever policy we'll support, that's what they'll support? Or are they more principled than that? And assuming that they are more principled than that, what do we, the people, need to do in order to give them the support they need to take what are sometimes unpopular but perhaps prudent decisions?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's one that I think is very nonpartisan in nature, and it needs to be, right? Because there are good people on both sides of the aisle that are trying to do the right thing. And I don't want people to take away too cynical a view of this, because I think it's exactly right that there's lots of principled individuals out there. I have really the privilege of working with many of them at the state level of government as members of ALEC, which is bipartisan group of legislators on both sides that really are in it for the right reasons. And so I want to temper my earlier comments saying that was probably pointed towards, let's say, a non-principled elected official that may just be out there doing it to, follow the normal incentive of being reelected. I do think there's a totally separate path of a principled policymaker, and I could name off, a bunch of them. I'm not going to drop too many names because then we're going to get into those, details. But I mean, there are so many of them out there that we work with on a daily basis that, say, I realize this may be bad for me politically, and they realize that incentive effect that I just talked about that is clearly evident out there that people want somebody to be doing something. That in many cases, they want the bacon to be brought home to their district or their part of the state, or let's say their state versus other parts of the country. And unfortunately, the mainstream media seems to reward that behavior, and many voters reward that behavior. But I think there is the kind of the counterculture in a way of legislators that are in it for the principled reason of, let's say, their business owners. I referred to one from Indiana earlier who owns a golf course, and she is very concerned about the liability issue as it relates to reopening the restaurant and parts of that business that are otherwise shuttered right now because of guidelines and real health concerns, perhaps. And that's an area where she's out to do it, not to make money, as a state legislator. And in many cases, people think it's a very lucrative career, but it confuse sometimes members of Congress who make in the mid $100,000 range, certainly six figures, with the anticipation that after retiring from Congress, you can go work as a lobbyist and make, perhaps 10 times that amount of money on an annual basis. State lawmakers, in many cases, make a fraction of that as their salary. So they're not doing it for the personal gratification or making, money. They're doing it for the principled reason. In fact, I always like to tell the story of New Hampshire, a state that state's motto is fantastic. It's live free or die is the motto of New Hampshire. Great state that does without an income tax, does without a sales tax. And their legislators, and I often ask this as a quiz, and really, and no one ever gets this right, their legislators make $100 a year. That's their salary. That's as a complete citizen legislature, and people serve because they want to give back. Many times they're retirees that have already worked a career and they want to give back to their communities. And you have to tip your hat and commend people, because this is a really, even though I talked about the differences between full-time states and part-time states in terms of when they're actually in session, these are full-time jobs, and they're hearing from constituents around the clock. They're going to parades every weekend. They're going, at least back when we were doing those on a regular basis, they're, normally would be going out to doing dinners almost every night of the week and being asked to give an update. So this is a real gift of service that many of them give. And so I want to be very careful, and people don't take the wrong takeaway from the incentive issue that politicians do face and the rewards that they get from, let's say, the mainstream media and some of their constituents for going and spending more and always kind of being out there and trying to give people something in order to help their reelections. I do think there's a massive amount of elected officials that don't follow that framework. So I want to be really clear about that. But
yes,
you ask what to do, and I think it's like a very nonpartisan way, regardless of your partisan affiliation, regardless of who represents you. It's so important to talk about kind of the free market generally, and what are the principles that you all learn at Northwood? What are the principles of a free society? And what's the Northwood idea mean to you? And what does it mean to the decisions that are being made at all levels of government? But it also then requires on our part, I think, really eternal vigilance to be actively watching what's happening around you. That maybe it doesn't always directly affect you or your business, but it's things that are really essential to the future of freedom and liberty in policymaking, whether it's in Lansing, whether it's in your city council meeting, whether it's in Washington, D.C. I'll tell you right now, you're going to have more of an impact to be able to weigh in and have your opinion heard when it's closer to you in your communities and in the Lansing than you would in Washington, D.C. But on a completely nonpartisan basis, it's up to all of us to stay plugged in, to be informed, and then to remember what are the things that we know from the Northwood idea that are good public policy practices across partisan breakdown.
I think there was an important feature of American culture that did exist in generations about the prudence of a balanced budget, not only in your private life, but at the state level. And I think they really did hold legislatures accountable for that. And politicians knew it. And it was a politically risky move to send your state government into debt. But now it seems that's no longer the case. And I don't know how to rebuild that, but I think that's part of what needs to happen. There's some questions that are related to this theme. Leah asks, what can we as lay people do to push back against the bailouts and government spending. Evan is asking about whether these packages will create inflation. So some of the questions seem to be around the theme of, are we ignoring the long-term consequences? What might those be? And if we are concerned about that, what can we as citizens do to express that concern or maybe get more responsible government?
Yeah, and there are real inflation, I think, concerns with the amount of the money supply expansion that we've seen. I think it could be, leading towards the classic definition of, lots of money out there in the marketplace chasing too few goods, right? As a classic definition of inflation. Now, it may require really a reboot of the economy for us to be able to see it in practice, and people are shuttered, and much of the economy is still not back up to full potential. It may not show up, but it's one of those things, as you know, Dr. Matchek, that once that starts to take hold, it takes a while to actually see that it's happening but we know it's happening when we see this money supply grow, and when we see the economy pick up, it's somewhat likely that we will see some decent inflation growth. The other part of that is, and I talked about this actually this morning to a group of Michigan legislators, they were saying, what's kind of the doom and gloom scenarios of what could potentially happen given the national debt and given the scenario that we're in right now. And as you know, Dr. Matchek, and maybe those on the webinar today don't know, I like to keep things, try to be as cheery as possible and find the silver linings in the economy and try to find, what are the solutions instead of dwelling too much on the doom and gloom. But there is, a real concern that if some projections come true that we hit 30 trillion in national debt by the end of this year, which is kind of an unfathomable figure considering where we were just 10 years ago, as we talked about. What would a sovereign debt crisis look like? I think we have probably some attributes that other countries certainly don't have as they've gone through this, as we saw it happen with Greece, as we've seen it happen in other countries around the world. It happens very quickly, and that's the scary part of it, is these things unravel quickly, and by the time they start to unravel, it's somewhat late for policymakers to do a whole lot about it. Now, we have going for us that we are the world's reserve currency still at this point, and many of our competitor countries or enemies would love to change that fact. And I think if that fact did change, it would certainly put the national debt in a little bit of a different, more dangerous focus of what it could mean for sovereign debt issues for the U.S. But when you look at debt to GDP ratios being basically higher than they've been since World War II in the United States, there's lots of warning signs on that horizon. And I think the way that we need to probably approach this is the first step of getting out of a hole is stopping to dig it deeper, right? Is the classic analogy there. And that's probably what needs to be happening. We're not going to solve a $30 trillion debt overnight. There's not a silver bullet to be able to reverse that in short term because it didn't accumulate in the short term. But we need to have a plan and a really strategic approach to tackling this issue before it gets out of hand. And I can't tell you, and I don't know that anybody could really tell you with a whole lot of certainty what out of hand would look like and what's the tipping point really. We just all know that this is not a good direction that we're headed in. And I think when you look at the ideas as we talked about, one way is we need to enhance our competitiveness. We need to enhance economic growth and get GDP back up to 3% or above clip once we're through this downturn. And I think, we're going to see a really ugly number in quarter two. Some estimates from JP Morgan and others say 20 or 30% negative GDP, which would be unprecedented in quarter two. We hope that quarter three and quarter four have a big rebound with some big numbers on GDP, but we need to get concentrated GDP levels back 3% to 4% growth, as well as adopting some sort of meaningful spending and budget restraint, such as the balanced budget amendment at the national level, that would be maybe combined with some sort of limitation on debt accrual and limitation on spending. I think those are all things that you can put your creative minds to help us think through what are the ways that the federal government can begin to address this before it's too late for all of us.
There's another question on that balanced budget amendment from Logan, who asks, the states who have balanced budget amendments, do they allow flexibility, rightly or wrongly, during crises such as this?
Great question, and it gets down to the mechanics of each particular state. They generally will have a safety valve put into whether it's let's say a rainy day fund proposal that states will keep assets for situations like these that then can be accessed, but only in times of real emergency, or there would be some sort of supermajority vote of the legislature that would be required to waive those rules. I think similarly, some states would have some flexibility on, at least in a temporary basis, waiving some of the more strict spending or debt rules that they have in place. I know one that I often reference is Colorado's Taxpayer Bill of Rights that is in the state constitution that limits the growth of spending in Colorado to population and inflation growth, which I think is a very innovative way that's kept Colorado fiscally responsible both over the last 25 years, run by Republicans and run by Democrats during that period. Colorado has stayed economically competitive and has generally lived within their means because of what we would call that institutional control on government growth, because it's put into their state constitution and it's very hard to change. Even though you do have some of these constitutional protections, generally there will be emergency clauses, though, that with a extraordinary situation, a supermajority vote, let's say, of the voters or of individual policymakers in that state can generally, at least on a temporary basis, waive some of the rules at least. It's awfully important not to make it too easy to waive the rules or they become meaningless. But on the other hand, if there's a mutually agreed upon by all parties a real emergency, then there are obviously some short-term needs sometimes to access more funds.
Certainly hope that one of the things that comes out of this is the idea that there are periods of unusual circumstances that do require these kinds of emergency measures, but you can't run it every year and you can't accumulate that debt. What worries me is the fact that it seems like it doesn't matter, crisis, out of crisis, in season, out of season. We seem very comfortable adding to our debt each year, and that makes it more difficult during times of crisis like this. It makes it more dangerous to counteract that with new debt. So, do you see? I'll let you react to that, Jonathan.
That's an important point, and I probably should have mentioned it earlier, is sometimes the most dangerous times for those of us who believe in fiscal responsibility are not these times. Ironically, it's a bit counterintuitive, but I think some of the most dangerous times are times that are boom times for the economy. And I think you've heard me say this in the last couple of years in the Freedom Seminar discussions, is sometimes when revenue is so hot and the economy is so hot, it's coming in just hand over fist, people are not thinking about how to economize and how to decide between needs and wants, but they're just going and being asked to spend it on 12 different things, and they're just saying yes, 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 and they're not putting it away for a rainy day. And in many cases, they're actually growing the debt during some of the best record times for the economy that we've seen in recent memory. And so to me, it's a missed opportunity, let's say, that we've had a boom equities market now for nearly a decade, the longest in recent memory, longest in anyone's lifetime, really, with some of the most, some of the biggest numbers in growth in federal revenues, where we've hit all-time record highs in federal revenues in recent years. And yet, if anything, the national debt has just kept going upwards during some of those times that would have been the opportune time where it would have been, much more painless, let's say, to address this national debt issue, where we could have used surplus revenue just to bought it down during some of those very good times in the economy. Unfortunately, at this point, it's a bit of woulda, coulda, shoulda, that we should have addressed it then. That is the best way, obviously, is to tackle these liability problems when you're not in a crisis mode, because now the discussion is how much are you going to add to it and what's the best fiscally responsible way to address the crisis when the debt has now accelerated to $25 trillion as we sit here and talk.
Well, as always, Jonathan, it's great to see you, and we appreciate the work you're doing on behalf of all of us. Keep up the good work, and thank you once again for joining us at the Freedom Seminar.
Thank you, Professor, and hope everybody stays safe and healthy. And please do reach out if you're interested in public policy or any of the things we talked about today. And congratulations on many of you graduating, I know, and great school at Northwood. Let's keep up the Northwood idea.